Thank you, Jonathan. Good afternoon to each of you. It is certainly good to be here. We have a great appreciation for this congregation, for her elders, for this lectureship. We have been somewhat associated with it over the last few years and have always benefited by our being here. Ann and I have talked about it several times. Whether we're on the program or not, Lord willing, we will be at this lectureship, because it's always a good lectureship, always very beneficial to us, and to be with Jonathan again and to know the good work that he's doing with the congregation here, certainly I know is a blessing to you as well. I've told several people that this is the ideal time for you to take your nap. After lunch, everybody's got to have a nap. Well, now's the time to do it. I'll be through in a few minutes and they'll wake you up. But we are supposed to talk about stretch to the limit. When I got this topic, I thought, why can they not assign me a biblical topic? Stretch to the limit. Where are you going to find that phrase in the Scriptures? But then as I began to work on the lesson and develop it, it turned out to be an interesting study to me, and I hope that it will to you as well. I presented this material at our home congregation, and it took me 3 lessons to do it. So those of you with hearing aids, you need to speed them up, put them on high speed so you can keep up, because we're going to have to roll it in order to get through with the material. But I think we'll cover the basis of it. What we do not cover, for the most part, is in the book, and you will have access to that. We live in a time and an age when there is the greatest potential for happiness. You know, when you think about the life that we live, and just take the average family, for example, every member of the family who is old enough has a car. Every member of the family has a cell phone. And that's not restricted to age. I know our 1-year-old granddaughter was visiting with us here recently, and she wanted my cell phone, she wanted Ann's cell phone, and so we found one and gave her one. And she's only a year old, so there's your cell phone. You know, we have iPads, we have televisions in every room, we just have it made. Ought to be the happiest people on the face of the earth. But when we look at the statistics, we understand that the suicide rate in our country is rising steadily. There's got to be a reason for that. And so as I thought about the subject, stretch to the limit, it seems to me that in some cases at least, there are those who are stretched beyond the limit. And consequently, they take their lives, some 40,000 per year. Now, that doesn't include those who are overdosed with drugs along the way, are taking their lives because things are not suiting them in this life for one reason or another. And they feel stretched to the limit in that regard. In 2017, according to the report from the CDC, there were 47,000 suicides, up 33% from 1999. That ought to be an alarming statistic to us who try to preach the gospel, who try to bring peace and joy and happiness to those who will listen to us. But are folks really listening? I remember on one occasion someone asked me, Sidney, when are you going to retire? I mean, being 73 years old, I guess that's what folks begin to think about. When are you going to retire? I said, I don't intend to retire. I'm going to preach as long as there's somebody to listen. They said, well, you might as well quit now because nobody's listening. Well, we joke about that, and maybe in some cases that's the truth. But when we think about this matter, those who are children of God especially ought to be the happiest people on the face of the earth. You recall in Philippians chapter 4, and incidentally for the benefit of you preacher students, you ought to do a study of the word joy or rejoice coming out of the book of Philippians. There are several reasons in that book that Paul says there is reason to rejoice. But in chapter 4 and verse 4, rejoice in the Lord always. And again, I say rejoice. Even under the most difficult circumstances, as children of God, there is reason to rejoice. In the closing part of the Beatitudes, Jesus would say, "Blessed are ye, when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you." And so that's where we need to be. But when we look at our society, even in our own lives at times, we feel stretched to the limit. I told my wife the other day, I said, I think I need some nerve pills for the next few weeks. I had this presentation today. I got a call the other day from Michael McDaniel, wants me to do 4 television programs for a television situation in our area. I'm working on manuscripts for Lectureship in Indianapolis, and I'm like, you want to talk about stretched to the limit? Right now, that's where I feel like I am. So what do we really mean by stretched to the limit? It just simply means that we feel like we hardly have enough time to do what we want to do. We hardly have enough money to do what we want to do. Sometimes we even talk about our patience being stretched to the limit. Those who have children probably understand that. And so when we talk about this matter of being stretched to the limit, we just feel like we're out of time, out of money, out of resources, whatever the case might be, to the point that we really don't know what we're going to do next. What I'd like for us to do is look at this from 2 parts, and basically all this material is in the book. There are some statistics in the front of the book that I'm not going to take the time to go over with you. It's entitled "The Fabric of American Life." And you can read those statistics, but what it simply says to us, that a good portion of married people with children feel like there is stress and pressure in their lives at least part of the time. Some 30% say nearly all of the time they feel stressed. They feel like they're under the gun, if you please, to be able to get certain things done. Even where there are marriages, parents with children, and both parents are working, there's the admission in many cases that I really don't think I give sufficient time to my spouse, whether it be the husband or the wife. In that regard, we don't spend enough time with them. So why is that? Why do we feel like we're rushed? Why do we feel like we're stretched to the limit? Well, I believe there's several things, and as I told the congregation at home when I got through with this list, if you want to add to that list, I'd be glad to get your suggestions, because I'm sure that this does not exhaust all of them as well. But I want to begin Matthew chapter 6, beginning verse 19, 20, and 21, where Jesus says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal." And then he made this observation, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." What is it that you treasure in life? If you were to spend some time with me, you'd figure out pretty soon what it is that I treasure in life. And likewise, if I spend sufficient time with you, I could figure out what you treasure in life. And once we figured that out, we know where our heart is, because that's exactly what the Lord said in that regard. So we have, husband and wife, we have 2 jobs. We're stretched to the limit simply because we are trying to have more material things. We used to use the expression trying to keep up with the Joneses. I think we're just trying to keep up with society in general anymore, because our world is focused on the material rather than the spiritual. And that is affecting those of us who are members of the Lord's church. That affects us on a daily basis if we're not careful in that regard. And sometimes it interferes with our worship time. So we have to be careful about where we put our focus, where we put our priorities, if you please, and more about that in a little bit. But besides the interest that we have in material things, I believe, and I see this in local congregations. I talk to other preachers. They assure me this is just not a problem in Martin, Tennessee. But there is a great deal of emphasis on sports anymore. I know that you ladies probably heard this statement in your class a while ago because I borrowed it from my wife. And I'm not sure who she borrowed it from right now. But the question was, are we raising athletes or are we raising Christians? And I think that is a valid question anymore. When we see the amount of emphasis that is put on sports in our society, and many times replacing spiritual matters. The kids have multiple sports. You know, when I was growing up and hearing other parents talk, and even occasionally today, I will hear some parents say, my child has to choose which sport they want to participate in. We don't have time to do all of the sports. We have 3 children, and this one wants to do 2 sports, that one wants to do 3. I remember a number of years ago, I've been a big tennis player and fan and instructor and coach through the years, and I was on a tennis team, and there was a lady that played some tennis with us. She had 4 children at that time. And I can recall many times when she would get to the tennis courts just in time for our tournament match to start. And I'd say, where have you been? Well, I had to drop child number 1 here. My husband dropped child number 2 there. When I get through here, I'm going to pick up child number 2 where he dropped her off, and I'm going to take her over here. I said, do you ever worry about losing your children? You know, you take them there, he takes them there. You pick them up here, he picks them up there. How do parents do that? I don't know. We did not deal with that in our family in that regard. And so, you know, when you think about the multiple sports, you think about travel ball, you think about practice, you think about game night, all of that comes to play in the realm of our spirituality and how it affects our relationship with God. And it affects how stretched we are trying to get all of that done in the limited time that we have. You know, I've often heard parents say, you know, we had to miss services on Wednesday night because our son or our daughter had ball practice. And if they're not at practice, and you know how insensitive some coaches can be, their idea is, well, if your child is not in practice, then they're not going to be able to participate in the game when it comes time for the game. Well, I think there's something that needs to be considered in that regard. Are you more interested in your child being at practice and being able to participate in the game? Or are you more interested in your child being in Bible study and being able to participate in heaven when this life is over? You know, what are we training our children to do or to be in that regard? So we have to be careful. I recall a number of years ago talking to a preacher's wife whose son was a great baseball player, and he was on a travel team. And I said, okay, y'all, you know, all these ball games are on the weekends. So how do you deal with it when you have a ball game on Sunday morning? She said, well, you know, if we have a late game, we'll try to find a congregation in the area that has an early service. And if we have an early game, we try to find a congregation in the area that has a late service. I said, what if neither of those works? Do I have to tell you what her answer was? We just have to miss services that Sunday. What are we training our children to be? Why are we letting sports be such a major part of our lives, and as a result trying to fit what little bit of religion we have into that mold with all of these other things going on? That causes us to be stretched to the limit. We talked about the material things a while ago. I know people, and you do too, who as soon as the latest iPhone comes out, what are they going to do? They're going to run to the store and get it. When the latest fashion comes out, in order to be in style, they're going to go purchase some of the latest fashions. And so they're constantly trying to keep up with what's going on, stretched to the limit in that regard. I believe as well a thing that stretches us to the limit or beyond is that we have our priorities upside down. We have allowed the world to set our standards for us. We have let the world decide for us what is important and what is not. If you want to really get a stir in a congregation, let the elders suggest that beginning next quarter, we're going to have Bible class homework. We're going to provide materials, we're going to provide books, there's going to be questions and answers, and your child will be expected to have their lesson up when they come to Bible class. The very idea. Do you not know how much time our children have to spend in their regular school books? Do you not realize how many nights a week we have to go here and go there to participate in all of the worldly material things in which we decide to participate? The very idea of suggesting now that we've got to find time for our children to do Bible homework. That's what you're going to hear. When I was a boy growing up, we had, if I recall correctly, and that was when I was real little, we had the little jewels. The Bible class material, and then gospel advocate material, and then other materials. And for the most part in my, especially my late 11, 12, 13, 14 years old, my dad was my Bible class teacher. You think I ever went to class without my lesson up? That was not a good thing. But now it's hard to get people to even bring their Bibles to classes. I've even had elders to say, well, we need pew Bibles because, we've got so many members that don't bring a Bible with them. And if you say, turn in your Bible to a certain passage and they don't have their Bible, then they can get one from the pew. Why would we go to Bible study without a Bible anyway? That doesn't make sense to me. But we are so busy, so stressed, that sometimes I just forgot to pick up my Bible when I left the house. Much less have my lesson up in that regard. So you try introducing Bible class work material and see what answer you get in that regard. I think about Timothy, and Timothy's been mentioned already several times. 2 Timothy chapter 3, beginning in verse 14. Paul would say to Timothy that he should continue in the things that he had learned. And Timothy, you remember where you learned them. Then he comes on down and says that from a child thou hast known the Holy Scriptures, which are able to make thee wise unto salvation. Timothy had been taught from a youth about the Scriptures. And consequently, the faith that was in his mother and in his grandmother was a faith that he possessed as well, not because it was theirs, but because of the instruction that he had gained through the teaching of his mother and grandmother of the Scriptures. How much of that do we find going on in homes today? Home devotionals, home Bible studies. What night are we going to do that? With all of the ball practice sessions, the ball games, the movies, the this and the that, when are we going to have time for family devotionals? That's why I say we have our priorities all upside down. Try to get your young people involved in youth activities of a religious nature. I know maybe it was Mike last night, talked about people who have a passion for their sport. Well, these parents who have children who are participating in all of these sporting events, they'll spend any amount of money to get the equipment and the clothing and whatever else the kids need. They'll make time for whatever travel has to be taken care of in that regard. Whatever time they need to spend, they're ready and willing to do that and see that their children are there. But you have some kind of a a spiritual, religious activity for those same young people. We don't have time for that. We're stretched to the limit already. Those are the kinds of things that we need to be thinking about in that regard. Then another thing that I think brings about certain stress and being stretched to the limit, we have a lot of single-parent households. I just can't imagine how that can be done. When here is a mother, for example, who has 2 or 3 or 4 children, she's left alone as the only parent of those children. She has to work to provide a living for them. She has to prepare food for them. She has to fix meals for them. She has to be a taxi for them. How does she get it all done? There's a lady at home that went through that, and I hear her talk frequently about what it was like for her to guarantee that her children had what they needed, not necessarily what they wanted, but just what they needed. And because of the extra pressure, because of the extra stress, because of the extra responsibility, there were times when she was stretched to the limit. But I think as well, a thing that causes stress and being stretched to the limit is the occasion when babies are born into the family. When you think about that, you might think, how does that affect anything? Well, if you've had a youngster in your family recently, you will remember. You think about the extra expense of the birth. You know, Ann and I were talking about it coming down here. You think about that abortion issue, which we don't like to think about, and where it is going, at the point where it has reached now, the age of that child. Such a sad state in our country. Killing them by the droves. But then when you turn around and try to adopt a child, it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. You know, and our question is, why, if the government, instead of funding all of these deaths, why don't they fund some adoptions and gives these children the opportunity to have a good family in that regard? So there's the extra expense. There's the extra household expense on top of the birth expense. Our grandson, who is 20 years old, is in college, just finished his second year at UT Martin. And we took him home a couple of weeks ago for the summer. I guess it was last weekend. Took him home for the summer, and I got a text from his mom, and he's 20 years old. He's of the same family that has the 1-year-old, and so there's quite a difference in the age groups there. But she sent me a text, and she said, I don't know where we're going to come up with the money to feed these 2 kids. I said, well, just think about where we've been for the last 2 years trying to keep your 20-year-old son in food. You know, because he eats a lot of grandma's cooking. There's extra expense. The more miles, the more expense. You think about the schedule changes that a child brings upon a family. You're used to going and doing as you please, and all of a sudden you've got a little one. And you have to work on the schedule of feeding and sleeping and all of these things involved. Then that baby gets sick. That's going to put extra stress. One of the saddest things to me is when a child, a baby, is hurting and they can't tell you where or why. All you know is they're screaming bloody murder and you can't figure out why. That brings a lot of stress. That causes us to be stretched to the limit sometimes in that regard. So when babies are born, that brings extra responsibility as well. Then another thing that I think brings stress, causing us to be stretched to the limit, is just a pure matter of selfishness on our part. Just pure old selfishness. Because you see, we don't seem to have time for a husband and wife. We don't have time for the children. That's already been discussed in a couple of different areas. So we'll skip right over that. But it's interesting to me that to hear a man or a woman say within a marriage relationship, but I have my rights. I have my rights. I'm sorry. When you married, you gave up those rights. It's no longer you and me, it's now us. It's now a mutual responsibility within that marriage relationship. In 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, Paul talked about that very thing, how that when marriage takes place, the relationship that develops out of that, one flesh. It's not about me, it's about us. Read Ephesians chapter 5, beginning with verse 22, how Paul would discuss the matter of the husband-wife relationship as it relates to the church and Christ relationship. He said, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, we could spend the rest of the afternoon talking about that, could we not? But then, as if we don't understand that, he follows that up by saying, husbands, love your wives even as your own self. Now, I can relate to that. And here's the way I usually illustrate that. If I've got a tennis match on a given morning, and I realize at 9 o'clock at night I don't have any tennis balls, I've got to run up to Walmart and get them. Man, I hate to do that. But you see, about an hour before that, my wife has come to me and she said, would you run up to Walmart and get me thus and so? You got to be kidding. It's 8 o'clock at night. I've already come in for the night, and you want me now to get out and go to Walmart? But at 9 o'clock, when I remember that I need those tennis balls for tomorrow, it's no problem at all for me to get up and get redressed and go to Walmart. Do I love my wife like I love myself, if that's the case? Be hard to explain that, wouldn't it? But that's the way he placed it. And so we have those responsibilities in a marriage relationship. In 1 John 2, 15 to 17, John said, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eye, the pride of life. Do you realize that all three of those things come out of this concept of selfishness? It's what I want. It's what I think I need in that regard. Aren't you grateful today that Christ was not selfish? When you begin reading in Philippians chapter 2 and verse 5, where Paul would say, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, was made in the likeness of man, became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. You see, Christ began to give and to give up when he gave up that equality with God. And throughout his earthly ministry, he showed time and time and time again his unselfishness. And then ultimately that death on the cross in that regard. In a book that was written by Faulkner Burkeen, and some of you may recognize those names as a couple of brothers several years ago. I don't know that they're still doing this, but they had marriage seminars. They put out a lot of material with regard to marriage. But in their book, What Every Family Needs, on page 17 of that book, that they gave some practical things to help us overcome that selfishness. And those are in the book. I'm going to let you read them for yourself. But as I stated earlier, those are things that I think of that create stress, cause us to be stretched to the limit or beyond. If you want to add to that list, write it down and give it to me. I'll be glad to consider it the next time I deal with this material. But I want to spend a little time now on solutions. I mean, what good is it to know where the problem is if we don't know what the solution is? I would suggest to you in the first place, we need to understand our purpose in life. In 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 11, you're familiar with the first part of it. We quote it all the time. If any man speak, let him speak as the oracles of God. But down in the middle of that verse, that God in all things may be glorified. That ought to be our purpose in life. Whatever it is that we do, it is to be designed to glorify God. Now, don't misunderstand things I've said already. I'm not opposed to sports. As I said, I've been a big, a tennis fan, player, coach, whatever, through the years. Still love to play. But when those things become our God, then we've got a problem. When they become our priority, we have a problem. Some time ago, one of our younger men in the congregation was absent on a Wednesday night. And so I inquired of his dad, where's your son? He said, well, he had ball practice this afternoon, and the practice ran up pretty close to service time, and he was just so tired, I just decided to let him stay at home. By the way, that guy's a deacon. Can you imagine? If I know that there's something that's going to interfere with my being able to worship God, whether it's Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, lectureship, gospel meeting, whatever the case may be, then I need to eliminate that from my life. I need to get my priorities straight. I need to have that sense of purpose that I'm going to do whatever I can to glorify God first and foremost. Matthew 6:33 has been mentioned a couple of times, but seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. So we need that sense of purpose. We also need to prioritize. Sometimes we need to let small things go. I have a little expression that I use sometimes when there's a little conflict or whatever, and we're trying to figure it out. My thought is, what difference is it going to make 10 years from now? Whether this child makes the ball team or not, what difference is it going to make 10 years from now? This statistic I did not get from my wife. I wish I had, but I think she had it in her lesson, that the number of young people who participate in sports who will eventually become professionals, it's almost nil. By the way, ladies, I meant to mention this at the outset. You heard my wife right before lunch. You're hearing me now. You can figure out which one of us is the better preacher. I suggested that at one congregation where she spoke during the Bible class period, and I taught the men. Then the worship service, I mentioned that. After services, one lady came out and said, Sidney, you don't want to go there. So I guess that's probably where it needs to stay. But we need to prioritize what is important. Listen, we belong to and we are needed in the family of God. That was so stressed in the studies last night. We need to maintain a meaningful relationship with the Father. I love the beginning part of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd. We have a personal relationship with God. And we need to maintain that to the best of our ability through study, through prayer, through our growth spiritually. We maintain that relationship in that regard. Then we need to maintain a strong relationship as husbands and wives in the home. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy. Do you realize that only 17% of marriages in this country are content with their mates? 17%. That's pretty low. Pretty low. 60% are unhappy in their marriages even though they stay there. 40% have considered leaving. And about 50% do, according to the divorce rate. We should never allow our children to come between us as husbands and wives, which is often the case. I've heard people say, Well, you know, in a few years, our children are going to be grown and gone, and then my wife and I are going to get reacquainted. Folks, that is as wrong can be. Because you've allowed those children to affect your relationship with your spouse. Yes, those children are important. They are a heritage of the Lord. But your marriage partner is important too. And you don't need to let anything weaken that relationship. And then finally, you need to maintain a strong relationship as parents with your children. We've heard lessons about parental responsibility and the child responsibility in that regard. I want to read you one thing in closing that might be of interest to you. You know, this idea of happily ever after, that's kind of a thing of the past, isn't it? We don't hear that much anymore. There's a study, a book that's been written, The New I Do, written by Vicki Larson, Susan Gadot. And they say about their book and their study that it is refreshing and surprising. Let me tell you what they found out. They found out that couples can live in separate houses and be just as committed as if they lived in the same house. That's the new I do. Oh, that's just starting. They found out also that couples can have outside lovers and be just as committed to their spouse as if they did not. That's the new I do. Then couples can marry for reasons other than love, whether it be money, financial security, for the benefit of children, whatever, and still have a happy relationship. Then they further say that couples can marry for a short time and then go their separate ways and have a successful marriage. Now, folks, if that doesn't alarm you, you see, that's the thinking of many of the people who want to be the leaders of our country right now. That's their thinking. That's the new I do in that regard. We believe this kind of stuff will continue to be stretched to the limit. But we need to get our priorities in order, realizing that our sole purpose in this life is to, whatever it is that we do, glorify God. Maintain that relationship with God. Maintain that relationship with your mate. Maintain that relationship with your children. And when you put those things into practice, it'll relieve a lot of the stress and strain and get some of those smaller things out of the way that 10 years from now, 15 minutes from now, will not make a bit of difference. Maybe these things will help us think about where we really are in life.